I remember that morning like it was nothing out of the ordinary. My routine was almost ritualistic. Coffee brewing in my tiny office mug, the soft hum of computers in the background, the faint smell of printer paper lingering in the air. I walked past stacks of contracts neatly piled on my desk, each folder a small victory in the world of supplier management. Everything was flowing like a well-oiled machine. I felt in control, almost invincible, and I liked that feeling. The office was buzzing, but not in a chaotic way. Phones ringing, keyboards tapping, the occasional low murmur of colleagues brainstorming deals. It was all normal. I logged into my email, scanning the usual flood of messages, supplier confirmations, meeting requests, budget updates. Nothing alarming. A sense of calm settled over me, like the predictable rhythm of a train gliding down familiar tracks. And then I noticed it, a small, subtle thing that I barely paid attention to at the time. A subject line from my manager, meeting canceled. Urgent follow-up later. No context, no explanation, just a curt line and nothing else. I shrugged it off. Maybe something came up. People get busy. I grabbed my notebook and started planning my day. Call the steel supplier about next week's shipment, check in with logistics for the delayed invoices, review contracts for pending approvals. The routine was comforting, a protective cocoon around me. But even in that cocoon, a tiny ping of unease tickled the edge of my mind. Something in the manager's tone, or lack thereof, felt off. By mid-morning, the office had fallen into its usual rhythm again. Coffee mugs clinked, chairs scraped. Softly against the floor, the faint whir of the air conditioner filled the gaps between conversations. I smiled at a colleague passing by, the kind of small, unnecessary smile that makes life in an office feel almost human. And still, that canceled meeting nagged at me, faintly, like a shadow stretching across a sunny room. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But looking back now, I realized that was the first ripple, the very first hint that the water wasn't as calm as it seemed. That I was at my desk, double-checking a shipment schedule, when the first call came through. The supplier on the line sounded frantic, their voice tight with confusion and frustration. "We don't have a contract anymore," they said, and for a moment, I thought I misheard. My heart skipped. "Wait, what do you mean you don't have a contract?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The silence on the other end was brief but heavy. Apparently, my manager had canceled multiple supplier contracts overnight. Without warning, without notice, without explanation. I stared at my computer screen, the emails I had just glanced over that morning now taking on a darker meaning. There were messages marked "contract terminated," automated confirmations I hadn't even realized existed. My fingers froze above the keyboard, and a cold knot of disbelief settled in my stomach. That I scrolled through the notifications again, hoping somehow it was a mistake. Surely, someone would have told me first. Surely, this couldn't just happen. But every email, every automated alert, every supplier call confirmed the same harsh truth. The contracts were gone, and the chaos had already begun. My mind raced. I tried to reason it out, telling myself maybe there was a larger corporate directive I hadn't been briefed on. Maybe this was some kind of strategic move I wasn't aware of yet. But deep down, I knew this wasn't routine. The unease I'd felt earlier that morning was now a full-blown alarm. I remember pacing the office, trying to process what had happened. The usual hum of activity suddenly felt oppressive. Phones rang more urgently now, keyboards clattered in panic, and whispers bounced off the walls of the open office space. Colleagues glanced at me, their expressions unreadable, as if they were waiting to see how I would react. And I had no answer. I felt paralyzed by the magnitude of the mistake, or betrayal, that had just unfolded. Every carefully built relationship with suppliers, every plan I had laid out for the coming weeks, now teetered on the edge of collapse. I sank back into my chair, my mind spinning, staring at the blinking cursor in my inbox. How could one decision, one impulsive act, undo months of work in the blink of an eye? I still remember the moment I realized this wasn't just a problem. It was a storm forming on the horizon, one that I was about to be caught in head first. That morning, everything had felt normal. Now, nothing felt safe, nothing predictable. And somewhere, deep inside, I felt a creeping dread that whatever came next was going to be far worse than I could imagine. The calls didn't stop. One after another, suppliers reached out, their voices tight with panic, disbelief, and frustration. Orders that had been planned months in advance were suddenly in jeopardy. Shipments delayed, materials held up, production schedules unraveling like a poorly knitted sweater. The office, once calm and organized, now hummed with tension. Colleagues whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously around, unsure who to blame or how to fix what was already broken. I felt the weight of every call pressing on me, each one a reminder that the stability I had taken for granted was gone in an instant that I tried to trace back the decisions, scanning internal communications, looking for anything that could explain why this had happened. But every trail led to a dead end. My manager's actions were inexplicable, and I was left standing in the middle of a collapsing system with no safety net. Flashbacks hit me in moments like this. I remembered walking a supplier through a contract. Just last week, shaking hands, exchanging assurances that we were reliable. They had trusted us, and I had trusted the process. And now that trust was evaporating before my eyes, leaving chaos in its place. The ripple effect reached every corner of the company. The logistics team scrambled to reorganize delayed shipments. Finance wrestled with unpaid invoices and contractual penalties, and even our customer service department started receiving calls from clients who sensed the disruption. I felt every failure as if it were mine personally. Each unresolved issue was a small blow to my sense of control. I could see the frustration on my team's faces, and I couldn't blame them. I felt like a captain watching the ship go down, powerless to stop the flood. It wasn't just the work, it was the human element. Suppliers I had built relationships with over years were disappointed, confused, sometimes angry. Some called repeatedly, some hung up mid-conversation, and others simply stopped responding. Each unanswered call gnawed at me, a growing knot of guilt and helplessness in my chest. I kept thinking, if only I had seen it coming. If only I could have stopped it. The office buzzed with activity, but to me it felt hollow, frantic, as if everyone was moving faster but getting nowhere. That day, I realized the consequences of one person's unilateral decisions could cascade like falling dominoes. What had started as a quiet, calm morning had transformed into a storm I couldn't control. Every email, every call, every frustrated glance was a reminder that the system we had built was fragile, and I was now trapped in the middle of a ripple that was growing wider, faster, and more destructive with every passing minute. I couldn't sit still any longer. Every frustrated call, every delayed shipment, every whisper in the office was a constant reminder that something had gone terribly wrong, and I needed answers. I walked down the hallway to the manager's office, my steps echoing off the walls, heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. When I knocked and stepped inside, the room was quiet, sterile, almost unnervingly calm compared to the chaos outside. My manager looked up from their desk, expression unreadable, as if they were simply waiting for me to speak. Why? Why were all the supplier contracts canceled? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tension made it crack in places. For a moment, there was silence, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, heavier than any stack of contracts on my desk. Their response was cold, detached, vague explanations that made no sense, excuses that sounded rehearsed. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to demand some shred of accountability, but instead I stood there, stunned by the betrayal. Everything I had worked for, every plan, every relationship with suppliers, was now hanging by a thread, and the person responsible was sitting casually across from me. I remember pacing the small office, hands gripping the back of a chair, my mind spinning. How could someone do this without even a conversation? Without a single warning? I thought, anger and disbelief clashing inside me. I had trusted this person, relied on them to communicate, to collaborate, to uphold the systems we had built together. And yet, in a single act, all of that trust was shattered. My manager offered no remorse, no acknowledgement of the ripple effect their actions had caused. Their indifference hit harder than any mistake ever could. Outside the office, I could hear the frantic energy of the team, the phones ringing, people rushing between desks, the constant undercurrent of panic. In that moment, I realized how isolated I had become, standing alone in front of the very person who had triggered the chaos. Colleagues might be angry, suppliers confused, production faltering, but I was the one expected to make sense of it, to pick up the pieces. And yet, the person who caused it sat there like nothing had happened. It was betrayal in its purest, most incomprehensible form, and I felt it deep in my chest, heavy and cold that by the time I left the office, I felt hollow. The confrontation had given me nothing but more questions, more frustration, and a stark awareness of just how alone I was in this mess. The ripple wasn't slowing down. It was gaining momentum, and I had no idea if I could stop it. I barely had time to catch my breath when my phone rang, the sharp trill cutting through the chaos of the office. Like a warning bell. It was the CEO. My chest tightened before I even answered, a mix of dread and anticipation twisting inside me. I picked up, trying to steady my voice, only to hear the words that would make the morning feel like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Where is he? The question hung in the air like a hammer waiting to fall. I froze, the knot in my stomach tightening. My mind scrambled. Did they mean the manager? Was I supposed to have answers I didn't even possess? The office around me seemed to blur. Phones continued to ring. Colleagues muttered under their breath. Keyboards clattered, but none of it registered. All I could hear was the CEO's voice. Firm, impatient, and demanding clarity I didn't have. I tried to explain the situation, to outline the chaos, to make sense of a series of actions that made no sense, but every word felt like it fell flat. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me from every angle. It was as if the entire company was looking to me to plug the holes that had been blown open by someone else's recklessness. That I remember staring at my desk, at the scattered contracts, and blinking email notifications, thinking about every small decision, every late night spent ensuring the supply chain ran smoothly. All of it felt pointless now, overshadowed by the single, reckless act of someone I had trusted. The CEO's question wasn't just about the manager. It was about accountability, blame, and the fragile illusion of control we'd all taken for granted. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me, combined with a sting of humiliation. How could I possibly fix this? How could anyone? As I ended the call, my hands trembled slightly, and I sank into my chair. The office felt suffocating, too loud, too chaotic, too out of control. Every unanswered question, every angry call from a supplier, every delayed shipment compounded into a relentless pressure in my chest. I realized then that this wasn't just a disruption. It was a collapse, and I was standing in the epicenter, trying to make sense of the ruin around me. The ripple that had started earlier that morning was no longer subtle. It was a wave, growing, stronger and more destructive with every passing minute. By mid-afternoon, the office had transformed into something unrecognizable. Phones rang incessantly, emails piled up faster than anyone could respond, and the normally steady hum of keyboards had morphed into a frantic clatter. Every department was scrambling. The logistics team ran from desk to desk, trying to reorganize delayed shipments. Finance wrestled with unexpected penalties and unpaid invoices. Customer service braced for angry calls from clients who were already sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. I could feel the chaos pressing against me from all sides, a tidal wave I wasn't sure I could withstand. That I found myself moving from one crisis to the next, jumping between suppliers, colleagues, and internal reports, each call adding another layer of stress. Every problem seemed connected, each small failure triggering the next, until it felt as though the entire system was unraveling in real time. Flashbacks hit me in these moments. The nights I had spent going over contracts, double-checking orders, personally assuring suppliers that everything was in place. All that effort now seemed meaningless, wiped away in one impulsive sweep by a manager who had acted without warning or reason. The frustration and helplessness were suffocating. I could see it in the faces of my team. Eyes darting nervously, brows furrowed, voices tense. The weight of responsibility had shifted squarely onto me, and I was struggling to hold it together. I kept thinking, if only I had seen it coming, if only I could have stopped it. But hindsight offered no comfort, only the stark reminder that one person's unilateral decision could dismantle months of careful planning. The office felt like a pressure cooker, every phone call, every urgent message adding heat, and I was trapped inside, trying to keep everything from exploding completely. By the end of the day, I felt hollow, exhausted, and more aware than ever of just how fragile the system we relied on truly was. The chaos wasn't just around me. It was inside me, clawing at my confidence, my composure, my belief that anything could be controlled. I realized then that I had entered a new reality, one where I couldn't trust the processes and perhaps couldn't even trust the people I relied on most. Every ripple from that initial decision had grown into a storm, and I was caught at its center, powerless to stop it. By the time the immediate chaos began to settle, I knew I had to understand what had happened. I couldn't fix everything yet, but I had to find answers, or at least a clue. I sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of contracts, piles of reports, and blinking notifications, feeling the weight of every unanswered question pressing down on me. I opened emails, reread messages, and scrolled through internal communications, hunting for any hint of why my manager had canceled the supplier contracts. Every thread I followed seemed to lead to the same frustrating dead ends. It was as if the decision had been made in a vacuum, with no rationale, no warning, and no care for the consequences. That I kept thinking back to the relationships I had built with suppliers over months, even years, walking them through contracts, checking in on delays, celebrating milestones. Those moments of trust and collaboration now felt fragile, almost naive. Flashbacks hit me in bursts, sitting in a sunlit conference room last month, laughing with a supplier over a minor scheduling hiccup, thinking, we've got this handled. And yet, here I was, scrambling to pick up the pieces of everything I had believed was secure. It was personal, even if the act itself had been professional. Someone's recklessness had torn apart the network I had worked so hard to maintain that I spent hours digging deeper, tracing chains of emails, scanning approval workflows, and cross-referencing reports, hoping to find some pattern, some indication of motive. Could it have been a miscommunication? A hidden directive from above? Or was it something more deliberate? An act of sabotage that I hadn't yet seen? The uncertainty gnawed at me, a slow burn of anxiety and suspicion. Every new discovery brought relief, then immediately another question. The answers weren't simple. They were buried under layers of human error, oversight, and perhaps betrayal. As the day turned into evening, I realized I had learned one crucial thing. Clarity wasn't coming easily, and the path forward would require patience, persistence, and an almost stubborn determination to understand. I wasn't just untangling contracts and shipments. I was untangling motives, behaviors, and trust. The chaos had forced me into detective mode, forcing me to question not only the actions of others, but also my own assumptions. And even as exhaustion settled into my bones, I knew I couldn't stop searching. The only way to regain control, to survive the storm, was to find the truth hiding beneath the wreckage. By the time night fell, I felt every ounce of my energy drained. The chaos of the day had left my mind buzzing, my hands trembling slightly as I scrolled through endless emails and reports. I couldn't escape it. Not the missed calls, not the angry supplier emails, not the growing sense of failure pressing down on me like a heavy, invisible weight. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashing images of contracts marked terminated, suppliers' frustrated faces, and colleagues whispering in hushed panic. The pressure was relentless, and I felt it creeping into every corner of my life. That I sank back into my chair, staring at the empty office around me, and felt a wave of despair I hadn't anticipated. My mind raced, looping over the events of the past day. How could I have missed this? How did one person unravel months of work in an instant? Was there something I could have done to prevent it? Each thought spiraled into another, feeding the helplessness that now felt all-consuming. Flashbacks came unbidden, late nights preparing contracts, painstakingly ensuring deadlines were met, personally reassuring suppliers that everything was secure. And all that effort, all that care, now seemed meaningless. The betrayal stung not just professionally but personally. I had trusted someone, and that trust had been obliterated overnight. That IT wasn't just the workload, it was the emotional weight. I felt hollow in a way that no spreadsheet, no contract, no call could fix. My confidence had cracked, leaving me raw and exposed. The sense of control I had clung to so desperately was gone, and in its place was a gnawing fear that everything I had built could collapse further, without any hope of repair. I leaned back, rubbing my temples, the office lights casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with my anxiety. For the first time, I truly felt the human cost of corporate chaos. Not just the logistical disaster, but the mental, emotional toll it exacted that I realized then that I had hit my breaking point. Every instinct screamed for me to step away, to escape, to shut the world out, but I knew I couldn't. The storm was still raging, and I was in the middle of it. The only choice left was to gather the shattered pieces, however raw and painful, and find a way forward. Even if it meant standing alone against a tide I hadn't caused, even if it meant facing betrayal, exhaustion, and fear head-on. After the exhaustion and despair of the previous day, something inside me shifted. I realized that staying in the pit of helplessness wouldn't fix anything. The contracts weren't going to magically reappear, suppliers weren't going to suddenly calm down, and production wasn't going to run itself. I had to act, even if it meant stepping into the chaos alone. Slowly, deliberately, I started reaching out, emails, phone calls, even late-night messages, trying to salvage what I could. Each small connection, each supplier reassured, felt like a tiny victory in the middle of destruction. It wasn't enough to restore everything, but it was a start that I organized my team, delegating tasks and responsibilities where I could, and for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of control. We prioritized urgent shipments, contacted key suppliers to rebuild trust, and began documenting the fallout to prevent further mistakes. Every action was measured, every decision deliberate. The chaos still surrounded us, but for the first time, it felt like we were swimming rather than drowning. I caught myself smiling at a colleague who had just managed to resolve a tricky supplier issue, a small reminder that even in the worst moments, progress was possible. Flashbacks crept in, not of despair, but of resilience. I remembered previous crises, smaller but still daunting, where careful planning and persistence had pulled us through. That memory gave me the determination to keep moving forward. I couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the mistakes or the betrayal, but I could prevent things from getting worse. Slowly, the office atmosphere began to shift. The frantic energy became focused, the whispers of panic replaced by murmurs of action. Even as I worked, I reflected on what this experience had taught me. Trust was fragile, control was often an illusion, and yet human resilience had a remarkable way of emerging when it was needed most. I felt a cautious hope, knowing that while we couldn't completely undo the damage, we could rebuild, adapt, and recover. The storm hadn't passed, but I had found my footing in the debris, and with each small step, I reclaimed a bit of the confidence and clarity I thought I had lost forever. Weeks passed, and slowly, the company began to stabilize. The contracts that could be salvaged were renegotiated, relationships with suppliers mended, and production schedules, though delayed, were back on track. I had spent countless hours rebuilding, stepping into every crack the chaos had created, and while the stress hadn't completely lifted, a sense of accomplishment quietly settled over me. I realized that control is rarely absolute, that trust can be broken in an instant, but resilience, the human capacity to recover, is something no one can take away. That I often thought about the manager who had caused the collapse, the absence that hung over the office, and the CEO's piercing question that had set off a chain reaction of doubt and responsibility. Part of me still felt anger, a lingering sting of betrayal that didn't disappear overnight. But alongside that, there was understanding. People make choices, sometimes reckless, sometimes selfish, and sometimes inexplicable. What mattered now was how I responded, how I rebuilt not just the operations, but my own sense of certainty and control that I in quiet moments. I reflected on the lessons this chaos had forced upon me. I realized how fragile systems are, how dependent we are on the people we trust, and how crucial it is to stay vigilant yet adaptable. I also learned that mistakes, others or our own, don't define the end. They are tests of resilience. And sometimes, the greatest strength is finding the courage to pick up the pieces and keep moving forward. As I walked through the office one morning, watching colleagues collaborate with renewed focus, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known. Since that first shocking day, the chair where the manager once sat remained empty, a subtle reminder of what had happened, but not a shadow over what had been rebuilt. I knew now that chaos would come again, inevitably, but so would clarity, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that even when everything collapses, we have the capacity to rise, recover, and continue.